All right, future guardians. Want to talk space power?
Let's do it.
Today we're diving deep into sustainment.
Which is?
You know how we keep those space forces up and running? We're cracking open Space Doctrine Publication 40. That's SDP 40 for you guardians in training.
Okay, SDP4 dear. Got it.
Think of it as our guide to keeping those space assets in orbit and ready for anything.
Okay, I'm intrigued because when I think space power, I'm thinking like lasers, right, warp speed, not like what kind of oil change we need.
Yeah, not exactly pit stops in space, although that would be pretty cool.
Right.
But it's more like the behind the scenes for some epic space opera. Totally vital, but easy to forget about.
Well, for sure.
So before we even open SDP 40, why is sustainment so important in space? Like, it's not like we can just, I don't know, call up AAA when something breaks down up there.
Yeah, no kidding. Space, it throws some serious curveballs. You've got extreme temperatures, radiation, those micrometeoroids zipping around.
Yeah.
And the distances, forget overnight shipping.
No Amazon Prime in orbit.
Exactly. So once something is up there, our options are limited. Software updates, redundant systems, and a lot of hoping for the best.
Fingers crossed.
Pretty much. That means every single satellite, every system needs to be as self-sufficient as we can possibly make it.
So enter SDP 40, our sustainment Bible, as it were.
That's one way to put it.
So is it just about, like, fixing things when they break, or is it more involved?
Oh, it is way more than just slapping some space duct tape on things.
Okay.
It really is a whole mindset, a philosophy almost. Anticipate the challenges before they even pop up. Make sure our forces in space can respond immediately when something happens. Oh, and we have to make these crazy, expensive, complex systems last as long as possible.
So this doctrine really covers the whole game plan for keeping our space stuff up and running.
Yeah.
Now, how does SDP 40 actually approach this?
Well, it breaks it all down into three segments, right? Orbital, terrestrial, link.
Okay.
Each one has its own unique hurdles that we got to figure out how to clear.
Makes sense. So let's start in orbit then. That's where the satellites are actually doing their thing. What makes that segment so tricky?
It's the limitations. Just think about it for a second. Trying to fix something complicated in a spacesuit with like what, a wrench, no hardware store in sight.
Right.
That's on-orbit maintenance. Tough, time-consuming, and risky as heck.
Yeah.
We're talking about software patches, redundant systems, and again, a lot of hoping those systems hold up.
And let's not forget the big one, the mother of all orbital constraints. Fuel.
You know it. Fuel is lifeblood out there.
Right.
Every maneuver, every tiny adjustment eats into that, and there's no magical space gas station to top you off.
Yeah, we can't just phone it in.
Nope. Every ounce matters. Big time. If we want to keep things running as long as possible, we have to manage fuel carefully.
Makes sense. Okay, so orbital segment, we've got very limited repair options, constant need to conserve fuel. What about down here on the ground, the terrestrial segment?
So you'd think being on Earth would make this part easier, right? But it's still absolutely huge when it comes to sustainment. We've got bases, launch pads, control centers, tracking stations, all that supporting our work in space.
Right.
And they're all over the globe. Each one has its own, shall we say, quirks.
So it's not just about getting things into space. It's about maintaining this whole network that supports those missions.
You got it. And
Hey,
we're
whoa.
battling stuff all the time. Crazy weather, storms delaying launches, natural disasters that could knock out a base. And then there's cybersecurity.
Right, lurking in the digital shadow.
Exactly. Keeping things running smoothly. Major coordination and planning. It never stops.
Wow. It's really amazing how connected everything is, even when we're talking about space.
It really shows how one small thing going wrong can cascade and mess up the whole mission.
Yeah.
Which brings us to our last segment, the link segment, keeping those communication lines open between the ground and our stuff up in space.
So making sure we can actually talk to our satellites.
That's the gist, yeah. It's the nervous system of space operations. And it might be the most fragile. I mean, think about it. Jamming, spoofing, people trying to listen in. Adversaries are constantly poking and prodding, trying to cut us off at the knees.
It's a never-ending game of cat and mouse up there, trying to stay a step ahead.
You got it. And why it's so important for anyone involved in space to understand the link segment and how
Yeah.
to protect it.
Makes sense. Okay, so we've got these three segments, orbital, terrestrial, and link, each one with its own set of challenges. So how does SDP 40 help us actually overcome these and make sure we stay on top in space? What are the core ideas it lays out?
It all comes down to 9 key principles of sustainment. We've got integration, anticipation, responsiveness, simplicity, economy, survivability, continuity, improvisation, and interoperability.
9. That's a lot to unpack.
It is.
Let's start with integration. What's that mean in the world of space?
It's like, think of it as the glue that holds everything together. It's how we make sure all the parts of sustainment, from logistics and maintenance to training the guardians, all of that has to work together smoothly.
So nowhere working in a bubble.
No way! Everyone on the same page. Unified command. Crystal clear communication. Everyone, from the engineers on the ground to the guardians up in orbit, working toward a common goal. That's integration.
Okay, so breaking down walls, building teams, got it. What about anticipation? How do you even start to anticipate problems in space? It seems like anything could happen.
That's where the real art comes in. You need experience, data, and maybe a little bit of gut feeling. You can't just react to what space throws at you. You have to be proactive.
So we're using old mission data, intel reports, maybe some modeling to try and predict what could go wrong.
Bingo. And then we plan for it. For example, we know solar flares can mess up our comms.
Yeah.
So we build in shielding, right? Have backup plans, procedures to minimize the disruption if, or really when, a flare happens.
So it's always about staying a step ahead of the game.
Always.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So integration keeps everyone on the same page. Anticipation uses what we know to get ready for problems. How about responsiveness? How important is that in space?
Oh, it's everything. Space is constantly changing. Equipment breaks, crazy weather pops up. Who knows what our adversaries will do next?
So you have to be able to switch gears quickly when things inevitably hit the fan.
You got it. Responsiveness means having systems and procedures in place that let us make decisions fast, shift resources around, change our approach if we need to.
And minimize that downtime
And
because...
it's downtime equals mission failure.
Exactly. Sounds like there's no room for rigidity in the Space Force.
Not a bit. Space is too demanding, always changing.
Right. Okay, so we've got integration, anticipation, and responsiveness. All critical. But what about simplicity? It seems a little counterintuitive when you're dealing with something as complex as space, right?
You would think so, but you'd be wrong. Keeping things simple is probably the hardest part, but it's absolutely critical. We fight against complexity every day.
How so?
You got to streamline processes, make sure procedures are standardized, keep things as straightforward as possible, because when you've got all these different teams, often in different time zones,
Right.
complexity can spiral out of control really fast.
So it's about making sure everyone is literally on the same page, same terminology, same checklist.
Because even a small miscommunication out in space, or someone missing a step, big consequences.
Right, because there are no small mistakes in space.
Exactly. And that takes us to economy.
Which in space, I imagine, means every ounce, every watt, every single line of code.
Matters. You said it. Every launch costs a fortune. Every pound we send up adds more complexity and power. Precious. We have to make every single thing count.
So it's about sustainability.
Yeah.
Efficiency, thinking about the long game.
Exactly. We squeeze everything we can out of what we have, reduce waste, and make sure every dollar we put into space, we get something back.
Right.
And space is a rough customer, so survivability is another huge principle.
Yeah. Not only building systems that can handle space, but can handle whatever else is thrown at them, right?
Right. So we're talking about radiation hardening, designing with cybersecurity in mind, and even planning for the possibility of space junk hitting something.
Space junk is a real problem, isn't it?
It's a big one. We're talking collisions at like 17,000 miles an hour.
Wow. Okay, so you design and build systems that are not only functional, but tough enough to last. And that kind of leads into continuity, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Making sure we always have access to our space capabilities and that they can keep working no matter what.
So even if there's, what, a cyber attack, a hurricane, equipment breaks, those critical space capabilities still have to work.
All of it. Think about it. Navigation, communications, intelligence gathering.
Right.
Those things rely on space. Any interruption, even for a few minutes.
That had a huge impact.
You got it. Especially now, when so much depends on what's happening in orbit.
Okay, so survivability keeps the systems running. Continuity makes sure they stay up no matter what. How about improvisation? That seems strange to think about when it comes to space. Like, it's so planned out.
You would think, right. But it's crucial. No matter how much we plan, no matter how much data, space always finds a way to mess with you. Stuff breaks that shouldn't. Situations change in a heartbeat.
And you have to figure it out right there on the spot.
Yep. We have to empower our guardians at every level to think outside the box, get creative, and come up with solutions with limited resources. Because in space, no one is coming to save you.
Right. You're it. You and whatever you brought with you. So it takes a special kind of person, someone who can handle that kind of pressure.
It does. And last but not least, we have interoperability. The idea that we're not alone out there. We have allies, partners. We have to work together.
So interoperability is making sure our systems can work with theirs, sharing data, operating together.
You got it. Think about a joint operation. We need a U.S. satellite to share what it sees in real time with allies halfway across the world.
So they can act on that information immediately.
Right. That's interoperability in action.
Okay, so we're talking about technology, procedures, training, even language. All those things have to work together if we want to be successful in space.
Absolutely. And those relationships are only going to become more important as space gets more crowded and more contested. We need to work together if we want to face those challenges, share resources, and make sure space is something we can all use safely and responsibly well into the future.
It's a good reminder that space isn't just about competition.
It's not. There's room for cooperation, too.
Definitely. Okay, so these 9 principles, they really lay out a good way to think about space sustainment and the challenges involved. But it's easy to talk about principles, right? It's putting them into practice that's the real challenge. So how does SDP 4.0 actually help us do that? How do we take these principles and use them to keep our space forces working?
You know what's funny about doctrine? People think of it as like this rule book, right? Set in stone.
Right.
But SDP 4.0, it's more like a toolbox.
Okay.
It gives you the framework to think about sustainment, but it gets that there's no one right answer for everything.
So it's about guidelines, best practices, things you can adapt to the situation.
Exactly. You need that flexibility out in space. Different missions, different systems. You got to be able to adjust.
So let's talk about those tools then. What's some of the practical stuff SDP 4.0 covers?
Everything. Maintenance, logistics, how vital our infrastructure is, training, host nation support.
Okay, well, let's start with the obvious. Maintenance. How do you even maintain something that's whizzing around the Earth at thousands of miles an hour?
It's not easy, but it starts with how you build it in the first place. You can't just like throw something together and hope it doesn't break when it's in orbit.
Right. So thinking ahead, planning for things to go wrong, making it easier to actually fix something out there.
Exactly. And when it comes to actually doing maintenance, the Space Force has 2 levels, depot level and organizational level.
Okay, what's the difference?
Depot level. Think of that as the really big stuff. Major repairs, big upgrades, software overhauls, that kind of thing. The stuff that needs specialized knowledge.
And special equipment, probably.
You got it. This is usually stuff we have to do back on Earth, if we can.
Which means bringing something back from orbit.
Which is not simple or cheap, and sometimes impossible.
Right. They're taking it to the shop for this stuff.
Nope. So then you've got your organizational level maintenance. That's more like your routine checkups, keeping things running day to day.
Got it.
So pre-flight checks, calibration, troubleshooting, all that stuff that keeps those small problems from becoming big mission-ending problems.
Yeah, ounce of prevention kind of thing.
Exactly. Making sure everything's good to go at launch and then that it stays that way once it's in orbit.
So a lot of that is remote.
You bet.
Yeah.
Diagnostics, software updates, and really relying on the guardians who are operating those systems. They have to be able to solve a lot of problems on their own up there.
Which goes back to those principles we talked about.
Yeah.
Improvisation, responsiveness.
Exactly. Because if something goes wrong out there, it can go from bad to, oh no, really fast if you're not ready.
And you can't exactly pull over to the side of the road when you're in orbit. So we've got maintenance, keeping those space systems running. What about infrastructure? What role does that play?
Infrastructure, huge. People forget how much is happening down here on the ground that makes everything in space even possible.
Right.
Launch pads, obviously, but also control centers, tracking stations, the whole network, really. Data analysis, all of it.
It's this whole hidden world that makes it possible to get those satellites up there and keep talking to them, right?
And it's global. Systems and facilities all over the place, working 24/7.
Okay.
And keeping it all running, making sure it's secure, up to date. That's a huge job.
Especially when you think about natural disasters, cyber attacks, even just stuff wearing out over time.
Yep. It all adds up, which is why SDP 4.0 is big on diversification, redundancy.
Not putting all our eggs in one basket, so if something happens, we have backup.
Exactly. And that actually ties into something else really important, host nation support.
Okay, how does that work?
Well, We don't launch everything from the US, right? We have partners all over the world. They host our tracking stations, those big antennas, even some launch facilities.
So those relationships are key to keeping everything running.
Absolutely. It's all built on trust, shared goals, and realizing that space security, that's important for everyone.
Right, because it's not like space just belongs to one country or anything. It affects us all.
It does. And as space gets more crowded, more competitive, those partnerships are going to be even more important. We have to work together.
Absolutely. So building those relationships is just as important as building new satellites.
More important, maybe.
It's really interesting to think about.
It is. And speaking of making sure things run smoothly, SDP 4.0 talks a lot about these things called RAM metrics.
RAM metrics. Okay, I'm not familiar.
Reliability, availability, maintainability. They're basically
Yeah.
how healthy is this system?
Ah, okay. So it's a way to measure how well things are working, how reliable they are.
Right. So reliability is how often does this thing actually work the way it should? Availability is how often is it actually up and running when we need it to be? And then maintainability, that's all about how easy it is to fix.
So you don't want something that takes a team of engineers 6 months to fix every time it hiccups.
Exactly. It's not enough to just get these systems up into space. We need them to do their jobs, to be available when we need them, and to be maintainable, you know? We
Right.
have to be able to keep them running without it turning into a massive headache every time.
Right.
And we actually track these metrics throughout the entire life of a system, from when it's just an idea on a whiteboard all the way to when we finally decommission it.
So are we talking like dashboards, real-time data?
All of that. It lets us spot problems early before they become disasters. It helps us use our resources better. And ultimately, it lets us keep these expensive, incredibly valuable space systems running longer.
Which I imagine is music to everyone's ears when you think about how much these things cost.
You have no idea.
So we're talking about the challenges, these principles, now these RAM metrics.
Hmm.
It really highlights how much goes into making sure our missions in space are successful.
It all goes back to that, yeah.
It really is amazing when you think about
It
it.
is. And that's what SDP 4.0 is all about, really, giving everyone that common understanding, the challenges, the best practices. It's all in there so that the U.S. Space Force can do its job and keep that edge in space.
Right, because it's one thing to have the coolest technology, the most advanced spacecraft,
Hmm.
but none of that matters if you can't keep it running.
You hit the nail on the head. It really is all about the people, the planning, the dedication to getting this right. That's what makes or breaks you in space.
It's easy to get caught up in the technology, the missions,
Oh, for sure.
but there's this whole universe of support behind it all that most people never even think about.
And none of it works without those people, without that support. That's how the Space Force gets things done.
So if there's one thing we want listeners to take away from this deep dive into SDP for sale, it's that sustainment. It's way more than just fixing stuff.
Way more.
It's about looking ahead, planning for problems, designing things to last, and always adapting to whatever space throws at you.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
It really makes you realize that every choice we make, from the way we build things to the procedures we write,
Yep.
all of it has a ripple effect.
Space is like that. What you do here, it matters out there.
That's a good way to put it. Well, thanks for joining us today for this deep dive into space sustainment. And for all you future guardians out there listening,
Listen up, Guardians.
sustainment, it's everyone's job.
That's right. You do your part. Keep those systems running. You are directly contributing to the mission, to the security of the United States in space. Don't ever forget that.
Well said. Until next time, everyone, keep looking up.